Hello and welcome back to a new episode of Marie's Mindful Makes. It's been a while, and the reason for that is that I kind of lost my sewjo. I lost my creative mojo in general, and I didn't feel much like creating. And then I also didn't feel much like talking about not creating, not being creative. And I gotta say, it's not the most unusual thing. Usually in January and February, I feel a little bit of a creative low because November and December are just crazy in terms of output. We have the festivities, we have all of the gift making, and then one of my best friends had a baby, so I was also making all kinds of stuff for that. So it was just a lot at once in December and up to the end of December. And then in January, I just didn't feel like making anything with my hands. And then also, January and February are just dreadful months. And this year, I feel like it's been the longest January we've ever had. February was a little bit better, but it was so grey and so cold and so wet. It was absolutely frustrating, and there was no way for me to get inspired by those grey days. It might be a good moment to look back on my less creative winter and to also talk a little bit just about this thing about losing the sewjo, losing the creative mojo, the nicho, however you want to call it. Because I feel that it's actually for a lot of us makers, and particularly for us hobby makers or leisurely makers, it happens every now and then that we just can't seem to stir up any creative juices. And very often it tends to really throw us into a little bit of an identity crisis because we see ourselves as creative people, and our creativity is so tied to how we see ourselves. And it's very often one of the things that we love about ourselves, where we're so proud of. And also where, I don't know if that's for you, but for me, it's also where I get a lot of my self-esteem from, of being able to create beautiful things and to show them off. Also just to have them and have that product and look at it and be like, wow, I made that. Amazing. And then if you're not in the mood to make, you also lose that sense of accomplishment. And particularly in those dark days, that can be very daunting. And I see it very often online, January and February, that people get very scared because we think that if we lose our creativity once, it will be gone forever. But of course, that's not how it is. It might feel sometimes like it, but my experience is that at some point, the creativity comes back. It might not always come back in the exact same way as it used to be before, but it usually comes back if we, first of all, accept that it's not there for the time being. And that is absolutely fine. We don't need to be having creative output all the time. We don't always need to be inspired or inspiring. Our imagination doesn't always have to fly high. Sometimes it's just the right time to hibernate, to do other things, to enjoy more input than output, however that might look. So yeah, I think the first really important things, note to myself, is to just not be so hard on ourselves and to also understand that our creativity in a certain time of the year is not what fully defines us, and we're still makers even if we don't make for a couple of weeks. So, what I find is that if I notice that I am just not in the mood to make things right now, the best way to go about it is very often radical acceptance. You just go with it. This is not the right time to be making dresses. So let's go and look for other things. And what I find is that one of the hardest transitions in January is to take down all of the Christmas decor, take down the fairy lights. We're not even taking down all of them, but there's so much decor that comes down. And then suddenly those beautifully decorated living spaces look dull and grey and empty. So, what I find for myself, one of the best things to do in January is to make those spaces a little bit more cozy, a little bit more homey. And that can look differently. It can just mean, which it very often does for me, is to maybe restructure a few things, bring out an old new vase, try to rearrange flowers in the pots, all of these kind of things. That's something to do. And this year, for some reason, I got really back into origami, and I spent hours making little origami cranes. You can see some of them here behind me. And it was a very unexpected outburst of papercraft creativity. I think it was sparked by me trying to do something on the Cricut, and I did the Cricut cutting part, but then the assembly part, I was just like, nah, another day. But with those cranes, they really kept me busy for a few hours on days, and it's really nice. And I think it's actually a very beautiful transition season decor because it's not seasonal at all. So it's perfect for February when you never really know how to decorate because nothing's going on in February. Another thing that I did that has nothing to do with creative output, but a lot with input just in general, was to read. In January and February are usually the months of the year where I read the most. And what I did this year is that I finally signed up to the local library, which I had been planning to do forever. So in January, I finally got that library card. And I find that libraries are perfect for those books that you want to read, but you don't really want to keep. Easy reads that you can read in a day, thick love stories, romance, historical romance is something that I personally very much enjoy. But first of all, they take up so much space in your bookshelf. And then also, how often do you really going to reread those books? But I did also read a few books from my own collection, and I want to share some of my favorites from this year with you. I have them here. One of the books that I read that I liked was Blonde Roots by Bernardina Evaristo. Evaristo is an author I really, really like, but all of the other books, I've read most of her books by now, and none of them are as good as Girl, Woman, Other or Mr. Loverman, in my opinion. Before that, I read also this year Soul Tourists, which I really didn't like. It was kind of weird, and the main figures were just so unlikable that I really did not enjoy the experience, and I also didn't have any main takeaways. But this was an interesting take on the history of slavery, where it is reversed history. So this was a good read. I enjoyed it. Then I reread Vicky Baum this year, and I actually read this one and then two others of her books. Vicky Baum is an author that I personally rediscovered because of this cover. I mean, look at it. It is beautiful. It is sparkly. It is so retro. I absolutely love it. Vicky Baum was one of the most renowned authors of Germany during the Weimar Republic, during the 1920s, 1930s, before National Socialism took over. And she was born in Vienna, in a Jewish family, and she, like, all of her stories describe society, or different parts of society during that period, and particularly also those clashes between really poor, really rich, and it's beautifully written. Vicky Baum had to flee Germany when the National Socialists took over. No, I think she actually left before. So she emigrated in 1932 to the United States. I have to fact check, but yeah, it is true. So in 1932, she emigrated to Hollywood, and in Germany, her books were then later by the National Socialists burnt. But yeah, I first read her as a teenager, when I had a seminar on in between war German literature, so literature of the 1920s, 1930s. And in that time, I didn't love it. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't like, wow, fantastic. But sometimes with books, you just need to wait a little bit. And you just need to grow into them. And yeah, this year, also last year, I've really, really enjoyed Vicky Baum. My sparkly golden collection of her novels is growing. This publishing house actually republished, I think like 10 to 15 years ago, republished and redesigned all of her German published books. So yeah, Vicky Baum, if you read German, you should definitely check her out. And if you do not read German, you should see if she's available in your language. And then this is a non-fiction book, The Power of Strangers. And it's funny because I checked the feedback comments on Storygraph, which is the book tracking app that I use. And people either love this book or they hate it. There is very little in between. And I loved it. But I think to enjoy this book, you need to have read a lot of academic literature so that your threshold to what you find acceptable is rather low. So this uses so many references and quotes so many people and studies and events and everything. It's very, very dense. But at the same time, it is written in very small, short chapters, so you can also digest them really quickly. And I just love the content of this book because it talks about talking to strangers in the streets, basically, or in like other places as well. Some of them are mediated, where you go to stranger meetups, but also then others where you just talk to people in the streets. And there is a very nice story to how I got this book. So I was in London last year traveling, and I was on my way to a museum. Well, let me check. The Tate Modern. So I was on my way to the Tate Modern, but because I'm traveling, didn't have any access to any internet. So I just kind of freestyled my way. It was the subway. And in between the subway and the museum, I got a little, I wouldn't call it lost, but I thought before I get lost, I'd rather talk to somebody. And there was this guy who was selling magazines at the sideway. So I walk up to him and be like, excuse me, would you be so kind to let me know what direction the Tate Modern is? He's like, yeah, sure thing. It's like there and there. And then we started chatting and we started talking. First, he wanted to know where I was from. And he said that it was so surprising to have somebody ask the way in such an old-fashioned way in these times of days. And I told him I was traveling. And then he told me that he migrated to London a few years ago. He's originally from Jamaica, and that he had a really hard time kind of getting his foothold because of cultural differences, and that he really misses of just talking to people, and that London and the British culture in general is a more hostile environment where people are very friendly to talk with friends, but it's like it's kind of weird to just chat them up. Even with the neighbors, there's very little interaction. So we had this conversation going for like 15 minutes, so not really long, but it was super nice. And we parted ways, you know, as you do. You're just like, okay, nice to meet you. And off I went to the Tate Modern, knowing perfectly where to go. And the friend that I was supposed to meet at the museum was really, really late, which I always find annoying. But trying to stay positive about being on vacation, I decided instead of going into the museum by myself already, I decided to go into the really big museum store. And the first book that kind of caught my eye, among many hundreds of books that they had, was this book. Mainly, for one part, because I've just had this little friendly interaction with that stranger, but also because I really think it is something that binds societies together. If you're being friendly and open-minded with people that you meet, and if your first instinct of seeing somebody for some reason is, oh, there could be a nice person, instead of hostility and or like trying to be being skeptical. And I found from living in Austria that people here are particularly skeptical of talking to strangers, and that usually when I mean there's always occasions where you just talk to people, otherwise it would be weird. So for me, I realized that being in Austria really makes me miss those everyday random, very little conversation that at the same time are very meaningful, because I think every nice social interaction is meaningful, while at the same time being really just in that moment, you know, without having any major consequence, or without being like, oh, we've had a nice conversation for 10 minutes, now let's exchange phone numbers and become best friends forever. That can also happen, but that is, for me, this is not the intention of why it is a good thing of being open-minded towards talking and engaging with strangers. So yes, this book, I really enjoyed it because it gives all of the scientific data to why it is important talking to strangers and why I'm on the right track, and Austrians are just a little bit strange in their skepticism towards strangers. Just putting this out there. One book that I did not read, but that I really want to read, and it is Little Women. But look at this edition. My sister-in-law hand-painted this for me. She put a quote here: "I intend to make my own way in this world," which is something that Joan March says. And it is just so beautiful. And my sister-in-law is clearly a very talented artist. And this has become her new hobby / side hustle. I link her Instagram here in case you want to check out all of the amazing art that she does. And this was my Christmas gift. And funnily enough, I've never read Little Women, even though it is such a classic, and I've read almost all works by Jane Austen, for example. So because I'm so scared of ruining this book, I wanted to borrow the book from the library, read it, and I'm going to put this one in my shelf. I mean, so far it's been on display in the flat because it's so pretty. But the local library does not have Little Women. And it's so funny because I've been to 3 different of their branches. First the more like in the quarters, and then the main one. And it has like they have Little Women editions in their catalog, but it was really, really difficult to find them in the actual bookshelves. And I've had several librarians go crazy with me over not being able to find that book. And then when we were finding that book, it turned out that it was all like edited kids editions, youth editions, like learning English with classics, that kind of stuff. And finally, when I was in the main library, the librarian was like, "It is unbelievable that in the city of Graz, the library does not have the real edition of Little Women." So they're getting it now. But I think I'll just have to be brave and read this edition of Little Women. But I'll make sure to not eat anything while I do it and to only read it with clean and freshly washed fingers. Yeah, and then for the last book, which I think surprises me the most, is that I really turned towards poems again. I've never really been very big on poetry besides a period when I was like 15, even younger, and tried to write my own poetry, which is a little bit embarrassing, as in like not the general thing of trying to write poetry, but the poetry that I wrote. It's like I wouldn't show it to the world. I just keep it for myself as a fond memory of my teenage self. And then I've always received a lot of poems in handwritten letters, and I always thought it was a little bit cheesy. But still, there is a place for poetry. And this winter, I found that place in me, very surprisingly. And I got this. This is one of the poetry books that I have in my collection, the favorite poems of the Germans, 100 poems. And I actually got it from my mother in 2006. So that is almost 20 years ago. And I mean, there are some poets that I really, really liked when I was younger, and particularly Joseph von Eichendorff, like one of these German romantic authors. I'm very big about romanticism, as in like the period. And I was going through the main reason why I started to look at those poems is because I wanted to know how that poem, where, okay, now this is going to be tricky in English, but in Germany, there is a term that's culturally very ingrained, is that every beginning is magical. Jedem Anfang wohnt ein Zauber inne. And it is a line from a poem by Hermann Hesse, the poem Stufen. And I was curious, suddenly, to know in what context it says that every beginning is magical. So I will read this in German very quickly, where it says, "Und jedem Anfang wohnt ein Zauber inne, der uns beschützt und der uns hilft zu leben." And this was mind-blowing because I never remembered that it is like that. It says every beginning is magical, which protects us and helps us to live, which is so powerful. It's like, it's like to really embrace the novelty and those transitions and the changes. And I think that was just exactly what I needed. And I got sucked into the favorite poems of the Germans. And again, similarly to Vicky Baum, I found that suddenly a lot of those poems really resonated with me. Not as in like, oh, Joseph von Eichendorff is like, he's writing so nicely and it's beautifully written, but in actually resonating with me. And it was so nice that it actually, going from that input of reading, it inspired me to creative output. And this is what I did. So I took one of the poems that I enjoyed the most, which is a poem by Hilde Domin. If you're German, you can read it now, can you? And I thought that it actually makes for a really nice little poetic mantra for those tired winter days, when you are looking for your lost sewjo and you're just looking overall just for anything. I mean, one of my favorite things to embroider is florals. I just think florals are such a classic and pretty thing to embroider. And coincidentally, I have become just this month again a storyteller for the Twig and Tail Sewing creative brand. And the Storyteller project is a team of different leisurely makers who come together on a voluntary basis, and we can receive any and all of the Twig and the Tail patterns to interpret them in the way how we enjoy it, and to just show the many ways of how those projects can be done, can be maybe adapted, etc. And the emphasis here lies on the storytelling of really taking time to go a little bit deeper into those projects. And I was already a storyteller in 2022, and I really enjoyed it, and I thought it might be a good thing for this year as well. And this is my first project. The embroidery is a New Zealandish local flower, the manuka flower, and I thought it just goes so well with that little poem and this entire thing. And then I just freestyled the handwriting, and since I was already in such a embroidery mood, I also finished this embroidery, which I started last year. If you go back to my embroidery video from last summer, you can actually see me starting this embroidery in that video, but then I just kind of stopped working on it, and then I finished it in February. This was a lot of work. This is many hours of stitching, but it's so nice, and it obviously works super well for my creative space, makes a very, very nice wall decor. So I'm super happy to have this as well, and the colors were just so nice to work with. This was a perfect project to get me back into creative living, being, doing. So it's interesting because I usually throughout the year I usually never do so much embroidery, but funnily enough, it was just the perfect project for those less inspiring winter months. And now the sun is out, spring is coming, it's getting greener outside, the flowers are slowly coming back, you can hear the birds chirping in the morning, all of these beautiful spring things. So naturally, I think that creativity is also coming back now, and I've been focusing on little projects. That said, I was courageous, and I was going to tackle dressmaking, and it was an absolute disaster. So that little sewjo that I had coming back in the end of February got killed very quickly. So I decided to really focus on smaller projects for the foreseeable weeks, and then if the time feels right, I'm gonna see and try to make another dress. But one of the things that I've been enjoying is this pair of socks. I already have the first sock ready. You can see it has like a really nice kind of leafy lace pattern. This is the In Bloom sock set, one of the socks by Summerly Knits. And here I'm going into the heel next. So yeah, a couple of days and this one will be finished. And other than that, we'll see. I mean, I have a lot of plans. I started to sketch some ideas. I even started to sketch clothing ideas that I want to make, some comfortable dresses, something to take me into spring and summer, but there's no rush. So, yeah, I also still have a lot of books that I want to read. So, I'm just taking it forward, but I want to try to make sure to post regular YouTube videos again. This break has been long enough. So, if everything goes right, let's hope that you'll see me again in 2 weeks, maybe with some new show and tell, maybe with just some general blah blah. Either way, I'm looking forward to see you again. I would love to hear your thoughts on sewjo and losing your creative inspiration in the comments. Can you do these feelings resonate with you, or do they not, and why? So yeah, let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this video. I would love if you would like to give it a like, and I hope to see you around next time. Goodbye.